Welcome on this beautiful winter day to this lecture at the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies. It feels like a family affair because we're all among friends and supporters of the Copernicus Center. My name is Geneviève Zubrzycki. For those who don't know already, I'm the William Sewell Collegiate Professor of Sociology and Director of CCPS, the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies. And I'm pleased today to introduce our speaker. But before I do so, I would like to mention a few forthcoming events that are important. So we made February the Ukrainian month. Of course, we've had plenty of Ukrainian-related programming in the fall. We had some before February. We will have some after. But in February, on every Monday, so it's on the 5th, the 12th, and the 19th. And then on the 19th, we have special Ukrainian events to commemorate the second anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So on the 5th, we have the film 20 Days in Mariupol, which was just nominated for an Oscar for Best Documentary. The two film producers will be in attendance. It's at the Michigan Theater. It's free and open to the public, so please come and bring your friends. Also on the 19th, again at 5:30 at the Michigan Theater, free and open to the public, Life to the Limit. It's a very impressive film that some of us saw already at DIA last year. It's a documentary about the war in Ukraine from actually 2013, starting with Maidan. Someone who volunteered to be on the front and fight. Most of it is shot on small cameras and iPhone even by the film director. So it's very raw, emotional, and starting with the beginning and not just 2 years ago. The film director, Pavel Peleshuk, will be also in attendance at the Michigan Theater. And last but not least, on February 19th, we have the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia's distinguished lecture, The Fight of Our Lives, by Julia Mendel, who's our distinguished fellow this year, and she's also a Wallace Fellow. And she's a journalist, author. She was President Zelensky's press secretary for 2 years. And she will tell us about her experience working with Zelensky and the first days of the war when her then fiancé, now husband, who spoke to us last week, went to the front. So I invite you to come to this. And before the event that's at 5:30? Yes, that's at 5:30. Before that, there's going to be a vigil also in the DIAG. I think it starts at 4. So we're going to be sending a lot of information about these events. We really hope that you'll be coming to this. And going back to the Copernicus Center, we have today's lecture, and then we have also one on March 14th by our own Dr. Eva Pasek, who will be presenting work from her doctoral dissertation, so on the Roma in Poland. So today, we have the pleasure to welcome Benjamin Paloff, who's professor of Slavic languages and literatures, as well as professor of comparative literature. He was my co-conspirator as director of CREASE for a couple of years, and Slavic stole him away from us, so now he's chair of the Slavic Languages and Literatures Department. He's the author of Lost in the Shadow of the Word, Space, Time, and Freedom in Interwar Eastern Europe, which was named 2018 Best Book in Literary Studies by the American Association of Teachers of Slavic and East European Languages. He's also the author of 2 poetry collections titled And His Orchestra, published in 2015, and then earlier, The Politics in 2011. Both collections of poetry were published by Carnegie Mellon University Press. In addition to this, he has translated about a dozen books and many shorter literary and theoretical texts from Polish, Czech, Russian, and Yiddish. Notably works by Dorota Masłowska, whom we hosted, thanks to Ben, Marek Bieńczyk, Richard Weiner, and Yuri Lotman. So we're very pleased to have Benjamin lecture today on this avant-garde film, Europa, to tell us a bit about the film before we screen it, right? The film is about 10 or 12 minutes, and to help us deconstruct or reconstruct that deconstruction of cinematographic deconstruction. So please join me in welcoming a warm welcome to Benjamin Peloff.
So just to warn you, the sequence of the images in my presentation doesn't always match the sequence in my mind, which always changes as I think about these things. So I may jump forward and ahead a little bit, just to warn you. So now that you've seen Stefan and Franciszka Temerson's film Europa, I welcome all of you to get up and leave and to go about your day, because you've already been enriched beyond the power of anything I intend to share with you. And I'm saying that not as a kind of theatrical demonstration of a therefore false modesty on my part. It's merely my sober assessment of two simple realities, or rather two features of one reality, this one reality that we are experiencing now. The first such feature of reality is that having seen the film, you can claim a familiarity with it that already exceeds what is displayed in almost a century of scholarship. Temerson's work, which encompasses avant-garde film, graphic design, and writing for children, has been the subject of dozens of scholarly articles, reviews, and book chapters since the early 1930s, when Stefan and Franciszka married and began a remarkable partnership in life and art. There's hardly any mention of their 1931 film, 31-32 film, Europa, that does not mischaracterize it in a significant way. I'll address some of those misprisions in this lecture. But even the most insightful minds can be forgiven for not seeing clearly what the eyes have never seen at all. This is indeed the case with Europa, which was considered lost after 1940, when the only known print of the film was seized by Nazi occupiers in Paris and believed to have been destroyed, and 2019, when the original nitrate film, almost complete, was discovered in Germany's Bundesarchiv. In the interim, Europa occupied the kind of tenuous existence that is far more common in media history than most publics might realize or recognize. That is, it was available, or it existed as a ghost or as a rumor, like a major work of antiquity that is available to us only in those fragments that other extant texts have quoted, which is how we know a tremendous amount of ancient literature only in quotes from other authors. The second feature of this one reality that necessarily diminishes my lecture is that this being a lecture, my remarks will inevitably explain, interpret, and contextualize what you've just seen, and this act of explication arguably becomes a negation of the very thing you've just seen. This point sheds some light on, or is perhaps the shadow cast by, the argument suggested in my lecture's title, an empirical film about an experimental continent, where, perhaps against convention, what exhibits the ethos of experiment is not the avant-garde short film, but the geopolitical reality, Europe, named in the film's title. For at the time that the Temersons made Europa, artists and intellectuals in Europe, and especially in the new states that arose from the breakup of empires at the end of World War I, were highly conscious of the experimental qualities of the new socio-political reality on the European continent. Borders and regimes were still in flux. The project of establishing and maintaining a stable, cooperative international order, a League of Nations whose promise and fragility was embodied in the League of Nations, was widely recognized as just that, a project, one that was already under threat from, on the one hand, rising fascism, which you can see a lot of suggested in this imagery, and which would in fact shatter the project of cooperative internationalism into antagonistic nationalisms. And on the other hand, from rapacious capitalism, which is indifferent to borders, ethno-linguistic differences, and the very same particularities that make cooperation both possible and necessary. That Temerson's film confronts the viewer with images that today we might call triggering, insofar as these images trigger emotional responses, including disgust, frustration, fear, confusion, as well as delight, hope, curiosity. Emotions that mirror as a condensed index or digest of affect the experience of contemplating Europe at that time. Even if you do not have an immediate interpretation or association with the images on the screen, and even without always knowing precisely what you are seeing on the screen, you experience the rapid shifts between formal and thematic contrasts, visual cacophony and an emergent order, or the contrast between nature and urban development, or between the human and the mechanistic, or between the individual and the collective. This emphasis on experiencing the film as opposed to understanding or interpreting it is key to the Temerson's art, and it is why I refer to the film as empirical rather than experimental. There is, it happens, a subfield of film studies that refers to itself as empirical, since it examines, among other things, the neuropsychiatric effects of the various forms of stimulus that one engages while watching a moving picture. I'm using the term empirical in a similar, if looser, way. While I will not be analyzing anyone's brainwaves or eye movements to substantiate my arguments, I nevertheless feel confident that in the roughly 12 minutes you spent with Europa, actually about 11 and a half minutes, you quite literally experienced, not just conceptually but viscerally, some combination of the following: disgust, worry, irritation, frustration, confusion, curiosity, fascination, delight, amusement, rapture. And you felt these things not through identification, which narrative theory stretching all the way back to Aristotle tells us forms the core of our emotional response to art. For Aristotle, how we identify with the hero, the narrative subject, conditions our response to what that hero endures within a narrative sequence. You might admire the hero, in which case you will experience the trials he endures as your own suffering, that's tragedy. Or you might look down on the hero, in which case his suffering becomes comic, and that's comedy. In narrative film, as in the theater, the art form with which it is most readily associated, there are naturally non-narrative or formal features that shape the audience's emotional response. The most obvious example, perhaps, is a musical score. The score that we just heard was added. And the musical score is very often downright prescriptive, right, in its eagerness to cue up the required effect. To this we could add tinting, editing, sound effects, and so on. While these can sometimes complicate or challenge our emotive orientation toward a film's content, for instance, when a visual or oral cue tells us not to be overly trusting of the outwardly charming stranger on a train, their primary function is one of amplifying the fundamentally narrative stakes of finding allegiance with a character and tracking that allegiance as the character navigates his or her circumstances. A non-narrative film, like Europa, like what we just saw, is no less dependent on our emotional responses, but it provokes that response, or those responses, without having us identify with characters and interpret their navigation of circumstances. Here, there are neither characters nor circumstances. While it would be an unjustifiable exaggeration to say that we are not still in the realm of representation, right? Even with the most visceral experience of film, we would appear foolish if we were to mistake the image of a train arriving at La Ciotat station for an actual train, right? It's still representation. But we can nevertheless recognize that in Europa, the conceptual distance between the representation and the thing or things it represents is radically reduced. So too is the interval during which an interpretation might take shape, leaving us with impressions rather than ideas. We might even come away from the image with, for example, a feeling of disgust at conspicuous consumption, or just watching the dude masticating. I mean, it's kind of gross watching someone eating that up close, right? We might have this feeling of disgust without being fully conscious of having witnessed a representation of consumption at all. We see the disgust. That's because in a narrative film like, and I just pulled up these examples as I was thinking about this over the weekend. In a narrative film like American Psycho or The Wolf of Wall Street, we encounter these themes of conspicuous consumption through the characters and how they behave within their circumstances in the film. With Europa, we get neither characters nor circumstances, leaving just the consumption itself. So you're not really reacting to how this fits in a story or a sense matrix. You're not making sense of it. You're just like, ew, gross. Oh, weird. Oh, beautiful. You're having an immediate emotional response that is not mediated by a story. The visual logic of such a representation, which strives for visceral immediacy, is frankly, and forgive my saying this, it's pornographic. It seeks an authentic, ephemeral, bodily response. It is in this respect that I suggest we might think of Europa as empirical rather than experimental. But I will propose a second and a third justification for this word choice. The second regards the intentionality of the film's method. The third, the traditions in which the filmmakers saw themselves as operating. And in these two reasons, you'll see that they're actually quite related in a way that I hope will be clear. Regarding intention, the Temersons were direct and unequivocal in rejecting the term experimental. Their objection was not complicated. They simply understood their own methods and designs, which were slow, often laborious, working frame by frame, and highly technical. In other words, they had to know in advance what they wanted to do and how to go about it. While they certainly had artistic ambitions that included stretching the capacities of their media, they were not testing things out here, let alone playing around with new materials. Everything had to be planned, executed, and refined. The approach in making this kind of film assemblage is much more that of an experienced sculptor than that of a child making a spontaneous collage from random magazine cutouts. And I often feel like this, I often find that when I talk about films or artworks that are described as experimental, the word experimental is in some ways insulting, because it suggests in some way that these people are just kind of fiddling around, they're playing around. This stuff is really, really difficult to do. They know what they're doing. If it seems a little odd, that's because it's odd. It's not because it's playing around. The third reason to avoid the term experimental is that the Temersons were highly conscious of working within received artistic traditions and a contemporaneous creative ecosystem that shaped the aforementioned intentions and techniques. And with this, we'll pivot slightly. This is where I'll actually show you some slides. We're going to pivot slightly into the shorter second movement, second half, really, shorter half of my talk, in which I'm going to flesh out the biographical and cultural context of this film so that we can see how the film you've just seen fits the lives of those who made it, not as an experimental one-off, but as an artistic product consonant with its time. So, Stefan and Franziska Temerson, and here's where the first place where I realize I'm going to have to skip way ahead because I think I actually have a photo of them at the very end. So you can see them in their late middle age. They formed one of the outstanding creative and life partnerships of the last century. Stefan, over here with the almost signature pipe. You see, whenever you see pictures of him, he's smoking his pipe. Very often with short sleeves, which is appropriate to someone who's working with graphic material, lots of ink and all that stuff, right? So this is Stefan Temerson. He was born in Płock, a historically important locus of both Polish and Jewish early modern culture. He was born to a Polish family. And after a childhood split between Poland and the Russian Empire, he moved to Warsaw in 1928, and the following year met Franciszka Weinlis, a Jewish art student. When they married in 1931, the same year they began work on Europa, their artistic collaboration was already well underway. They'd made their first film called Apteka, or Pharmacy, in 1930. It remains lost. But we know that it consisted of photograms made frame by frame. For reference, for those of you who are maybe not familiar, film projected at a standard frame rate runs through 24 frames for every 1 second of viewing. So when you think of these filmmakers making photograms frame by frame, they have to do 24 of these sequences in order to produce 1 second of film, and this becomes almost a race to the bottom, as it were, for art animators for the rest of the century and into the current century. That is, if you're tracking the history of animation, which the Temersons had a significant influence on, what you find is that art animators are developing increasingly Baroque ways of having to put more work into shorter spans of film. Eventually, maybe we'll get someone like Piotr Dumawa to come visit us on campus here, and he can tell you how it takes him about 3 or 4 years to produce about 5 minutes of film. So this is where this is really gets insulting to think of this as merely experimental. It takes a lot of work and a lot of planning. By this point, by the point that these two started working on the film Europa, what I just called a photogram was already a favorite method in art photography. And let me now go way back to the beginning to show you what this is, in case you're not familiar with this this method. This is a photogram. It was used frequently in art. It still is used frequently in art photography, but it was used beginning in the 1920s, commonly used by art photographers associated with Dadaism and Cubism. It was very widely used in the work of Man Ray. This was already well established by the time they're making this film. And it's the way you make a photogram is by placing an object directly onto a photosensitive medium and exposing that medium then to light, so that the shadows that are cast by the object don't register on the medium. But where there is no shadow, that would then be exposed, and that creates a photographic negative. It's essentially like taking a photograph without a photo camera, right? You're placing the object directly on the film and exposing that to light, so that the shadows that are cast by the object don't register, and different visual effects, in fact, can be produced not by moving the object, although you see them do that in this film. That's how they work frame by frame. They move the objects on the photographic paper, but they also will shift the light relative to the medium so that it'll cast different shadows without moving the object. And that's where you see things kind of wave around the object. That's because they're moving the light source around the photo medium. Whereas in conventional photographs, what is recorded is the light that is reflected off an object, which can actually create a visual deception, right? For example, if you're taking a photograph of a reflective surface of an object that's otherwise transparent, it'll appear opaque because of the reflected light that's coming back at the camera. Whereas a photogram records not the light that is cast off the object, which is lost. Instead, it records the object's silhouette and its degree of opacity. It's very similar to an X-ray, which is something that was also being experimented with in photography at the time. And if there is an innovation to the photogram in that early film, 1930, Apteka, and then later in Europa and their later films, it is the addition of time. The animated sequence of photograms in Europa occurs within a temporal scheme otherwise absent from a static image. So you can see the photogram moving, but then you can have these other filmic techniques that then jump you to other images. The other filmic techniques in Europa include jump cuts, kaleidoscopes, and photomontage, or superimpositions. These were even more established within the filmmaker's toolbox at the time the film was made. Feature films were certainly using these techniques readily. Audiences were already used to them. The expressionist films being produced in Berlin, Prague, and the Temerson's own Warsaw would foreground these techniques to amplify the psychological effect of the narrative. And in the avant-garde, which we expect to foreground formal devices anyway, the diminishment of narrative representation makes the jump cut or the photo montage that much more effective. So we go from these images are actually in the film's original sequence. You go from this photogram of flowers and branches. They love flowers and branches. They're in most of their surviving films. You see flowers and branches in photo negative. But you go from that to the tracking shot from foot to head of a man who is clearly not of the well-to-do classes. He has his sleeves rolled up for work. And then go immediately from him from the individual worker, as it were, to the sameness of silverware displayed in a very expensive restaurant where that man would never be able to afford to eat. And so on. So you can just jump from one thing to the next, and this will have some thematic or sense resonance for you. Some of these images are deliberately kind of mocking. The film is deliberately propagandistic in its approach to anti-fascism. The fat cat who just eats, and he's eating at a restaurant. I don't know if you saw that the menu, he's eating at the restaurant called Europa. He's just consuming Europa all the time, and go immediately from that to someone shouting propaganda, to which they then jump to an artistic rendering of loudspeakers that then proliferate symbolically through a photogram. Right? So they just sort of move on from one thing to the next. Some of these jump cuts are actually deliberately, I think, reminiscent of editing that we would expect in other film. For example, if you're familiar with Louis Buñuel and Salvador Dali's film Andalusian Dog, Un Chien Andalou, which came out a couple of years before Europa, it's perhaps most famous for this image very early in the film, in which a woman's eye is being held open with a straight razor right in front of it. And then what Buñuel does with the jump cut is he jumps from this to the image of an actual straight razor slicing through an eye. It happens to be a cow's eye, but you don't know that. You just see a man with a razor in front of an eye, and then it slices through it, and it's rather horrifying, and so much so that the effect, what we now call body horror, it's now a regular part of the film repertoire. The effect is so immediate and so visceral and powerful that the reputation for this scene tends to precede or preclude, in some cases, a viewing of the film. I remember it was years before I would even venture to watch this movie because I'd heard so much about this one image. But I have to assume that they were aware of this image, and that when they then have the hand slicing into an apple, which in most European languages actually is a synonym for the eye, that they're doing something, that it's a kind of tongue-in-cheek visual synecdoche with what people had already seen in avant-garde film, which was Buñuel's slicing of the eye in Andalusian Dog. But when we have this visceral response to it, where you see the razor blade in the eye and we kind of tense up, this is without any sense of who the person is, why this is happening, how it's going to affect her later in life, why we might care. None of that is important. It's not contained in this. One could actually contrast this with scenes where the significance of bodily harm is almost purely narrative. For example, I was thinking about this earlier today, contrasting this, or for that matter, this, with the film Reservoir Dogs by Quentin Tarantino, where there's and also, rather, for those who are familiar with more recent American film, there's a famous scene where a police officer's ear is cut off. And that was another thing where I didn't really want to watch that movie for a while because I was afraid of that scene. The thing is, you don't see it in the movie. It's all contained within the narrative because it's a significant plot point and it animates plot. You don't actually need to see the violence occur. It's just built into the story. In this case, there is no story. All there is to see is the violence. You're supposed to have the visceral reaction to the thing itself, not to what it would mean within a narrative universe. In Europa, the image of a knife held horizontally across this apple really does, I think, suggest this visual synecdoche with Buñuel's earlier film. And so we can see that as far as technique goes, there isn't much in Europa that could properly be called experimental. Just to give you one more example, because you can go from this, they go to the mass production of slices, right? Of everything being made the same, and then everything being consumed the same, right? Which has strong symbolic value, I think, as a kind of warning about fascism or fascisms. But one other visual kind of echo would be in Europa. You have this flag that rises up over the city. This is after a montage of several related kind of transparent flags, and it really does echo several shots from October where you see the flag rising up. But it doesn't have to be literal or direct that they're paying an homage to Eisenstein. The fact of the matter is you could see lots of propaganda films during this era where the raising of a flag is seen as an unequivocal positive, whereas within the film Europa, it's seen as something to warn against or to be concerned about. So as far as this technique is concerned, Europa could not be really properly called experimental. They were not trying to create a new kind of cinema. They were operating within an avant-garde tradition that was already well established with its own audiences, venues, and expectations. And if I were perhaps better prepared, I would show you, I did have in my photo archive, the posters advertising the film, screenings of the movie. And what was striking about them is that they look exactly like the same posters we would see around campus here for the Ann Arbor Film Festival, where they screen avant-garde films and documentary films not for mass distribution. The posters look the same because they actually say, come see these avant-garde films, and they curate them with other avant-garde films. So there's already an expectation of what the audience is supposed to get out of this. The Temersons then made 3 short films, 3 more in Poland, a movie called Drobiazg Melodijny, which I've often seen translated as a musical moment. I don't like that as a translation. I would call it like a melodic trifle or something like that. Zwarcie, or Short Circuit, and Przygoda Człowieka Poczciwego, The Adventure of a Good Citizen, which is of all of those movies, is the only one that survived. The other, they deposited 5 movies in Paris in '38, and only that until Europa, only that one last film survived. But now with Europa, we have 1 more, which brings the total. Now we have 4 out of their 7 films. And hopefully, if you find one in the Bundesarchiv, you start to fantasize. So I'm starting to put together my own little research proposals for that. Much as we sometimes feel tempted to frame such dramatic changes in the artists' lives, they had moved to Paris permanently in '38 after some years of going back and forth. We tend to frame these big moments in their lives within larger societal upheavals of their day, to say, for instance, that they saw kind of which way the wind was blowing and decided to move to Paris, or that they're fleeing developments back home. The political situation in the late '30s in Poland was quite poor. But the fact of the matter is that Paris is where a lot of exciting things were happening in art in the '30s, and they just wanted to be there. So that's really that's how they described their decision to move to Paris. It was just exciting stuff going on. They wanted to be a part of it. And they established very productive relationships with an international coterie of artists and writers. In Paris, that's also where they deposited 35mm prints of their 5 films with the Wittwer Film Laboratories for preservation. after the outbreak of the Second World War and the Nazis seized them, which is why every critical treatment of Europa between 1940 and 2019 is based on a film that had not actually been seen. So it's really, really, if you're the kind of scholar who enjoys correcting other people's errors, this is a lot of fun because there's a lot written about this movie, but no one had seen the movie they're writing about. So you can say like, well, actually, it's not this and not that. For one thing, it often says, and I'll get to this just in a second, but often the criticism will say that this was a movie that was based on a poem, or that it illustrates a poem or adapts a poem, and none of this is exactly true because the Temersons, particularly Stefan, was very direct about this. The poem already existed, and he didn't want to interpret the poem. He took the poem and used it, and this is his term, he used it as the screenplay. He just used the poem itself as the shot-by-shot screenplay for the film. When the Nazis invaded Poland in September 1939, Stefan and Franciszka both quickly volunteered to fight. There was not yet an effective Polish combat force abroad, and so the chaos of the moment ended up separating the couple for about 2 years. Franciszka was a cartographer for the Polish government in exile, and she followed it to London. By that point, Paris had fallen, and any hope of an organized fighting force of Polish legionnaires in France fell apart with it. And so Stefan ended up stranded in occupied France for about 2 years, trying to get to London, which he eventually did. And they reunited in London, and they spent the rest of their lives there. They established a press. They produced multimedia art and literature. That included their last 2 films, Zvivavmi Pana Smita, Calling Mr. Smith, and Oko and I Uko, The Eye and the Ear, which is a kind of animated photogram film that I've sometimes taught in the context of art animation. Both of those films were made during the war. Franciszka then died in 1988. They lived a nice long life in London, and Stefan followed about 9 weeks later. They just were kind of inseparable. In treating the film Europa and where it fits in this extraordinary twin biography, I've so far neglected one other tradition that again appears much less revolutionary in its cultural context than it might today. When we've convinced ourselves, as it seems that most societies do from one generation to the next, that we are the inventors of the very things we have inherited, whether we're talking about sex, politics, or even the idea of what it means to be a revolutionary. The tradition I'm referring to is that of the photo poem. Let's see if I can jump ahead to photo poems. That is a lyrical composition in which photographic and other design elements form an integral whole with the text that they shape. This kind of publication, often a direct collaboration between poets and graphic artists, was a common, well-distributed, and publicly accessible product of the avant-garde, or rather of various avant-gardes. They're constructivist photopoems, futurist photopoems, surrealist, Dadaist. And it just happens that some of the most powerful specimens of this art in Czech literature are available for purchase from Michigan Slavic Publications in the Modern Languages Building. That's my shameless plug for what we do. But this, for example, from Vítězslav Nezval, Czech surrealist poet, Vítězslav Nezval's photo poem called Abeceda, or Alphabet, is reprinted in a facsimile edition by Michigan Slavic Publications on the 3rd floor of the MLB in translation. So everything is translated. And this, one of the fun things about these photo poems is sometimes when we do have an enterprising publisher willing to do the work, what they will do is they will translate the work and format it exactly, the translated text exactly into the original publishing arrangement, because it's not just text, it has to be sort of bound together. Among the most prominent practitioners of the photo poem in Poland in the interwar period was Anatol Stern. he was a Jewish futurist poet from Warsaw who composed the text of his poem Europa in 1925. This is from the year before, 24, and this is a photo montage composition done by, the text is by Anatol Stern and by Bruno Yashensky. Yashensky is also a very interesting writer and poet from this period. He died at the hands of, he was murdered by the Soviet government. But in the 20s, it was common for these poets and graphic designers to work together to make something like this composition called, Earth to the left, as it were, or Earth, leftward Earth, or I don't know exactly. It's always this weird linguistic game that they're playing. The design here was, this particular book was designed by Mieczysław Szczuka, who also designed Europa. So not this cover, I should say. This cover was designed by Teresa Żarnowa, another graphic designer. But this is the cover, and then the interior looks like this. And this edition does exactly what I said the more enterprising publishers have done, which is to replace the original Polish language text with a literary translation into English, but to format it into the original exactly. I will actually pass this around because I took it out of the library. This is an English language edition of Stern's poem Europa in its 1929 photo poem arrangement, and it was published by the Temersons, because the Temersons established their press in London after the war, and it's mostly an English and Dutch language press, and so they, lacking their own film, were willing to put together, to reconstruct aspects of it in this little essay at the beginning, and then to reproduce the Stern poem that had inspired the film to begin with. So I'll just pass that around for those of you who are interested, as well as a copy of a facsimile edition of Earth to the Left. This was produced in the 70s in Poland, but it is an exact reproduction of the original from 1924. For those of you who might be interested. These books are designed to be tactile, they're designed to be held, they're not made for e-readers, right? Their actual format, their layout, which makes them more difficult to reproduce, but that's part of the point. The materiality is key. And so this particular book was designed by, as I said, Mieczysław Szczuka. I don't believe that Szczuka ever actually saw the fruits of his labor, because as I said, the poem was originally written by Stern in 1925. That is a time of enormous socio-political upheaval in Poland, where, in fact, the fruits of Poland's effort to establish its own independence in 1918 had become, let's say, had turned dark. And the level of corruption, the rise of a very virulent form of right-wing nationalism bordering on fascism was making people rather depressed. So there are lots and lots of texts, novels and poems expressing misgivings about the future of Europe, about what it will turn out to be. Szczuka, as I said, I don't think he ever actually saw the fruits of his labors, because the book was published in 29. He fell off a mountain in 27. He was an avid mountaineer, and he was making his second attempt up a vertical rock face, and it didn't go well. So he died quite young, in fact. But the Temersons took this work from 1929 and really thought, this is something that we can do in film, that is to make a photo poem out of film. It is not really a story, it's not the kind of film where it tells a story. It is rather very similar to the experience of reading Stern's poem in its original, or not the 1925, but in its redesigned photo poem format. And And so even the images that Strucker added to the text, you can see show up in the film itself, right? Where you see the buildings rising up, and you also have a photo montage superimposition of human bodies that are shaped like the buildings or reproducing the angularity of the buildings, which is, again, right out of the tradition of the photo poem, using visual synecdoches between words, ideas, and the human body. This anxiety about the mechanization of the human body, or the mechanization of human beings being reduced to mechanical products, et cetera, is all over the film. But the conclusion of the film is totally ambiguous. It does not tell us at the end whether we should feel that the Temersons have made a negative or positive verdict on the future of the European project. Instead, the film ends. There are always these hopeful elements, right? You have the little root, what is this, weed that kind of grows up between stones. And of course, if you've ever, since they still use block paving in Poland, you see this all the time. This is why you trip, right? But then the very next image is actually a tree that has grown up rather beautifully out of this urban setting. And then the next image you see there is the tree being cut down, and there's this back and forth, which expresses the anxiety about the future of the European project. The end of the film, of course, which I wish this were a little clearer, the end of the film is the image of a body jumping off a diving board and falling into the abyss, while in the background you can see the silhouette of a beating heart, which earlier in the film, and this is perhaps the most obviously symbolic moment in the movie, where you see the beating heart, and then the rhythm of the beating becomes SOS, right? Calling for rescue. But at the end of the film, you have the beating heart, and what happens next is anyone's guess. We just take the plunge. And so thank you all for taking this plunge with me. I hope that you enjoyed it, and if we have time, it would be my pleasure to evade your questions.
We have 15 minutes for questions, and I thought we were not supposed to. Is this on? I know. I'm trying. It's not on. I thought we were not supposed to interpret. And you just did?
I told you at the beginning of the lecture that the lecture would be a negation of the film.
Right, okay, sorry, I missed that part.
That's why I asked everyone to leave.
Because there was a clear narrative
in
your interpretation.
Yeah.
But yes, we have 15 minutes, so please.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's working.
Okay. So I think I saw the same paradox that you tell us that there is no story, but you tell the story. So, but I think it's important, beyond going to just acknowledge Stern's poem as an origin of this film, I would not see it as a completely separate work. Mm-hmm. Because I think this is basically an emotional track that I think is intended. It may stand separate, but actually it conveys, give us cues how to sort of respond to something. Mm-hmm. So it cannot be fully sort of decoupled and treat in separation. And when it comes to the Stern's poem, I think it's I heard you repeating that this is an anti-fascist statement and so forth, but I tried to find the original poem somewhere on the web, almost impossible, and only bits and pieces, because Stern himself revised this poem multiple times, and some of it was because of the censorship, some of it because his views have changed. But I tried to read the pieces that I could, and it seems to me that this is more of an anti-capitalist rant. At the time, this is sort of a left perspective on how things go. And fascism didn't register there, at least not yet, even by the date of the poem's creation.
In 25, yeah, that's right.
Right. So, and if this is so ambiguous, we can give any kind of attributions to it or interpretations.
No, I think that's it's an excellent point. I think you're totally right. I agree that Stern's poem is much more anti-capitalist than anti-fascist. I would say that, in fact, that and you're right also that in 25, fascism was not nearly as much on people's minds as it was in the early 30s, especially after 33, but before as well. Stern was also a futurist, and the futurists were, the Polish futurists were very strongly aligned with the Soviet project, or what they believed the Soviet project itself would be. I mentioned like Yashensky is, oh sorry, that's not, did I lose my slides? Oh, there we are, thank you. Let's see if I can find, So Bruno Yashensky, I mentioned, was murdered by Soviet authorities, but before that, he had been a darling of the Soviet Union and had lived in the Soviet Union for quite some time. But he, like other Polish futurists who felt an allegiance with the Soviet project, they were almost all suppressed. I mean, and most of them were Jews as well, I should mention. And those two things were not unrelated. But I would say, so the Polish film criticism will tend to refer to Europa as an anti-fascist film, and I think you can make that argument because of the emphasis on mass media propaganda and kind of churning out people who are just kind of the same and can be used as cannon fodder. We have the imagery of war as well. But I would nevertheless say that the content of the poem does fit this general anxiety about what the future of the European project is if it's not to guarantee the rights of the dude who has the rolled up sleeves. I could go on actually about this for a while, but I think I'll leave it there if that answers the question. Yeah.
Maybe this is a little bit. Is this on?
You need to turn it on.
Thank you. Maybe that was a tremendous presentation. Thanks, Benjamin.
Thank you.
Maybe this is a little bit of a follow-up. Since Temerson said they were, following actually the poem as a screenplay, it would seem that if one could find the version of the poem that they were using, that they were not so much inventing the thematic associations as they were demonstrating the capabilities of the art form. That from what I've seen of their other films, they're really interested in all the different kinds of things that can be done with film. And if you would compare this, for example, with something like Man with a Movie Camera, where they also borrowed some images, it seems to me, like the typewriter was one of them,
Right.
And others, that, Vertov makes a big deal about everything that he uses is actually captured from real life. But that also kind of limited the kind of material he used, whereas they're going to use drawing, photograms, diagrams, collages. It's just like they were like looking at that script and thinking about what can we do interesting formally. In other words, maybe their main interest was that. So that's just a comment, I guess. But here's my question. You said that, the criticism of the film is all, based on people writing about a film that they haven't seen. But I was wondering if the film was advertised in 32, presumably some of the people who went to these avant-garde screenings did see it. They don't deposit it till 38.
Right.
So there are 6 years there where people could have seen it. I was wondering whether you came across any criticism that was actually informed by viewing.
Yeah, there's actually a fair amount from the early 30s, from those early screenings in Warsaw. It was immediately recognized as an accomplished artwork. It gets reviews, which is a weird thing, but well, I didn't really like what the characters did. But it does get reviews and it does get some art criticism as well, but it's never referred to as, at least not that I've seen, it's never referred to as experimental. It's understood as avant-garde, which for writers of the time means that it's in a separate, as you know, in a kind of separate track within the same media ecosystem. It's not this totally obscure thing that only academics on the 10th floor of Weiser Hall are talking about. It's something that you could go to the movie theater and see. It would not be playing for more than a day or two at a time, but people went to see this. I actually, since connecting, Herb, what you just said to Zbignev's comment is, I would describe the film, at least their approach as I understand it, is not to illustrate the poem or to interpret the poem, but to translate the poem. That they did an intermedial translation, which a lot of my students, when I teach translation theory and comp lit, a lot of them take on intermedial translations, including illustrations or ekphrastic renderings in text of visual matter. They're very interested in how you move from one medium to the next. It's a common problem for students who are interested in how you go from novel to film or film to novel, that sort of thing. And as we often discuss in translation theory, when you translate, you're never translating into someone else's time and place. You're always translating into your time and place. And so a poem that has imagery that is explicitly anti-capitalist becomes in 1931-32 something where the exact same imagery will strike them as anti-fascist. Right? That it's simply a translation into the new circumstances of one's own time, using one's own materials.
Yeah. Ben, I wanted to add to this before Kate has a question, but I wanted to add to exactly what you said, that the musical track is doing just that.
Exactly.
So I wonder, even if we had watched a film without the musical track that tells us also what's going on, it's sending all sorts of cues, not of the narrative kind that you might be saying, but still about things slowing down, gets more aggressive, etc. So,
or where they add the kind of the propaganda speech as,
right.
As an audible shadow behind the.
So I wonder how
music.
much that actually perhaps betrays the intent of the filmmakers who didn't have any. They could have had a musical track.
Yeah.
Did not.
That's a great question, and I have absolutely no answer to it because I've done no research into their intentions for an
audio. Because it makes it more palatable for us in 2020, 2023.
And there's also, again, you're always dealing with tradition.
Right.
Because Poland, for all kinds of historical reasons, Poland has this enormous tradition of improvisational jazz. And so every 2 or 3 years when they find a new movie in an archive, I think the last one I can remember is Mocny Człowiek, which is a really wonderful expressionist film from 1929 that was believed lost, rediscovered in, I think, the mid-2000s, and then printed as a DVD. But of course there's no soundtrack, so they have to find a jazz quintet to do a kind of improvisational soundtrack, which of course they can do because they've been doing improvisational accompaniments in jazz in Poland for decades, right? So there's a way in which each composer is kind of building off the earlier composer, which is not necessarily what was intended here. I think that, that's one of the reasons why even in this, I can hear Krzysztof Kometa somewhere in the background, right? What's this?
I was going to say exactly what you said. So
Yeah.
I thought that the soundtrack that they added was a kind of betrayal of the film.
Yeah.
Because they clearly made an artistic decision not to have an accompaniment. Because they used Lutosławski.
Yeah.
Lutosławski did his first film clip
Yes.
for them.
Yes.
And so they were very much aware of deliberate
Yeah.
decision to have no soundtrack.
And their extant films still have a soundtrack, and they're all they're all specifically tied to a major Polish composer.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, at the time.
Not major at the time, major now.
But I was really annoyed by the music because it was so obviously associated with it that it's a narrative in a sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think I think that's a perfectly fair point.
We have time for one more question, maybe quickly. So you'll have to be
I'll have to be efficient
efficient
and brief.
Kate, and then
Two of my weak points.
All right. Just to follow up on this really interesting conversation, how much of this is sort of the residual interpretation and reinterpretation? What's happening in the interim between 1940 and 1988, and how are the Temersons sort of reinterpreting their work after the fact? And is this just this sort of palimpsest that we need to pull apart, and as we translate and retranslate and retranslate?
I think that's an excellent. Thank you, Kate. That's an excellent question. I think there are layers of kind of almost. I won't say misremembering, but there's a way in which our memories of the past are very much shaped by our needs in the present, right? And so they lost the film as well as 4 others. And they were conscious of having lost the films, right? So they stopped making movies in 45. They made 2 more movies in 43 and then 45. And they reproduce a lot of these techniques. So especially oko I ucho, eye and ear, it consists largely of these photograms of flowers and plants and things like this that you already saw. Then they wanted periodically, Stefan in particular, throughout their lives, they wanted to try to reconstruct the movie. And they only had certain frames and stills. And because they were collaborating with lots of other artists, filmmakers, et cetera, through their publishing house, they would sometimes be approached by a British filmmaker, and there was one in particular, who decided to do his own reconstruction of their film, not really having any of the materials from the film other than a few stills, right? This inevitably reshapes their thinking about what they remember having done with no record of what they had done, right? And then on top of that, they get a copy of the 1929 edition of Stern's poem and decide to republish that, only reframing that, as you saw the publication I passed around, also reads almost as a promotional brochure for the movie that doesn't exist. Right? So each part of this is reshaping what they thought they were doing or what they remembered having done. And then what I don't know is what parts of this print that we saw there were gaps in. Because what I've read is that the print that was rediscovered was almost complete. And then you have to how do you complete it? You have to insert something. It suddenly becomes like Jurassic Park, like inserting some other animal's DNA to complete the sequence. So in each one of these instances, I do think it was reshaped. Stefan tried on a couple of occasions to reconstruct the movie himself, but didn't complete any of those. So inevitably, I'm sure that if they were to see this, that they'd be like, oh wait, that was in this one? Inevitably, right? Because they lost 4 other movies. So they don't necessarily remember what went into each one. Yeah.
Okay. Mine is less a question and more just I'd like to express a sense of wonder and also follow up on what you said about translation into our times. Mm-hmm. Inevitably.
Yeah.
And I was just really amazed by how universal and timeless that is. Mm-hmm. And basically, since we are very clearly in another moment of anxiety for the European project, I was just kind of kept wondering, particularly after the last scene, what exactly is the abyss that we're currently jumping into? And the fact that they didn't answer, there was no optimism and no pessimism, makes it very acute. Like, we really don't know. And that's the only sentiment that can be truthfully expressed, at least for me.
I think we should probably end on that comment, but I will. Can I add a footnote to it? I think that this film expresses something that I think about, frankly, all the time in the American context and also in the European context. It's that when we lose sight of these things, the United States, whether the United States or the European Union, when we lose sight of these as projects and start to imagine them as birthright, essence, spirit, and we lose sight of them as projects, they become doomed. That it is necessary sometimes with a film like this to wake us up and to say, we actually have choices here. We can totally go this way if we want to. But if we actually see this as a project, we have to be actively involved in it.
Well, that's more pessimistic than...
But I should have left it. I should have. Yes, right, exactly. Let's all jump into the abyss.
Thank you very much, Benjamin.
Yeah, thank you all.